I mean, he's been out there.
Yeah, he was in San Francisco until the 80s.
What is he? What did he do?
He was
Oh, okay.
All right. Hello, everybody here in person. Hello, everybody watching online. Welcome to our book talk tonight. We have Richard Hermann joining us, who wrote this book here, Eminent Riparians, Biographical Sketches of Finger Lakes Luminaries and Leading Lights. He's going to talk to us about the book and the people in it, and we're in for a real treat tonight. So thank you for joining us. And if you enjoy the talk, if you want to support what the Ontario County Historical Society does in the future, and you are able to, I would strongly encourage you to donate either in person or online. All the help goes to allowing us to continue to do educational programming like this in the future. But without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Richard Hermann.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you all for coming. It's a bigger crowd than I anticipated. I anticipated my family period. I think what I ought to do to begin with is define riparian, because since I wrote this book, I've probably had 100 inquiries of what does this mean? What is this? So the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as relating to or living or located on the bank of a natural watercourse, such as a river or a lake. And there you go. And actually the title is something that I stole from a guy named Lytton Strachey, who toward the end of the 19th century wrote a really good book called Eminent Victorians, which I thoroughly enjoyed when I read it way back when, probably in college at some point. So why this book? Well, I needed a fun project after the two prior books I had written, one of which was Mother's Century, which is about my mother's life, which included escaping from the Holocaust, getting to the United States, and she really had a pretty interesting 101 years on this planet. And then the one I wrote after that was called Close Encounters with the Cold War, and which is really about some of the stuff that I experienced during my career, which had to do, oddly enough, with the Cold War, a lot of it. And as a consequence of that, both of those were kind of stressful and emotional. And I needed a project where I didn't have to get involved emotionally. And all my life, I'd been kind of collecting stories about the different people that grew up in this 87-mile area, I don't know if you all can see this, between Rochester and Syracuse, these 11 lakes, crammed into this narrow area and produced this remarkable group of individuals that I don't know if any other place on earth in such a small region can claim to have produced so many unusual people who became national figures. Maybe it's true everywhere, but I doubt it. And I've always told my friends and our visitors when we're up here in the summer that they are now welcome to the epicenter of the known universe. The selections were fairly obvious, and I started out with a group maybe of about 20 that I'd collected. And as I started researching them, I came across more people that they had interacted with who came from this area. And that was pretty impressive to me, and the number got a little bit out of hand. There's actually 62 biographical sketches that are in this book. The problem is that you tend to leave people out that you don't know about and that you only hear about later on. And that happened to me, and it happened the first time. We were up in the Thousand Islands last summer for a few days, and as we were checking into our hotel, I was talking to the proprietor, and he says, well, of course, one of the leading lights you've written about is Henry Flagler. And I said, no. I couldn't possibly have overlooked somebody as significant as Henry Flagler. He says, well, he was born in Canandaigua. And I said, get out of here. There's just no way. Well, since then, I have written this guy an apology because I discovered that, yes, Henry Flagler grew up in Hopewell. He lived there for 14 years before he moved on. So then I thought, well, now wait, he can't possibly be the only one that I've forgotten. And as a consequence of that, I started rummaging around and I came up with two more. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about them because, of course, you're all going to read this book. And so you'll find out about everybody else. But you're not going to find out about Henry Flagler and the other two folks that I omitted. So I will tell you a little bit about them. Flagler was born in Hopewell in 1830. His family, after he completed 8th grade in Canandaigua, moved to Ohio. And when he got to Ohio, he became very entrepreneurial. And he ended up first working in a grain store for $5 a month. Within 8 years, he was the owner of that grain store. And as a result of that, he got to know another guy who was involved in the grain business, also an eminent riparian from Richford, New York, which is a little bit southeast of Ithaca, named John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller and Flagler became great friends. And when Rockefeller decided that he was going to abandon the grain business for the oil business and start a refinery, he went to Flagler and he said, how about coming in with me on this? And Flagler thought, well, yeah, this is an interesting opportunity. So he became a 25% owner of the refinery. Well, by 1870, the business had expanded to such an extent that Rockefeller formed Standard Oil, probably the most notorious company in the history of the United States. And Flagler became secretary-treasurer of the company while Rockefeller was president. Flagler then moved to New York with Rockefeller and the Standard Oil headquarters, and his wife got very ill. So he decided, well, why don't we move her to a warmer climate and we'll see what happens. So they went to Jacksonville, Florida. And in Jacksonville, he got very intrigued by the possibilities of Florida as a tourist destination. And his wife passed away there after 3 years. He very quickly remarried, and he spent his honeymoon in St. Augustine. And he was totally blown away by St. Augustine, as were we when we were there. But we don't have his entrepreneurial imagination. He did, and so he decided he was going to build a 540-room hotel in town. And now that he had that, he had to have some way for the tourists to get there, so he built a railroad. And it brought the tourists in, and ultimately that railroad went all the way down to Key West. And he also eventually built the breakers in Palm Beach. I don't know if any of you have ever been there or seen it. It's about a mile south of Mar-a-Lago. But it also has a great history in the annals of the right wing in this country, because it is where, over lunch with Bill Buckley, Barry Goldwater decided to run for president in 1964. That particular section of Palm Beach is one that some of us probably should avoid. So Flagler ultimately basically created Florida, the concept of Florida, the idea of Florida as a tourist mecca. He married a third time, and decided that for this wedding present, he was going to build a 75-room, 100,000 square foot mansion, which he did. And a few years later, he fell down the stairs and died. So the next person I came across, who was Finger Lake's luminary, happened to be Daniel Shays, whom I'm sure some of you know of from the dim recesses of high school history, Shays' Rebellion, where Daniel Shays took objection to being taxed by the state of Massachusetts and decided to raise the farmers and rouse them and start his own first, but definitely not the last, insurrection against the government. And after that, he was tried in absentia, and he was sentenced to death. But he had gone into the Vermont woods, and he hid out there for 8 years, until he received a pardon from the government. And at that time, he also received a pension. He had fought as a captain in the Revolution, but he had never been paid in 5 years. And the pension was given to him because of that fact. And so what's he going to do with his pension? Well, the first thing he did was take to drink. The next thing he did was move to Livingston County. God knows why. But he spent the rest of his life in Livingston County, and he died in Sparta, and he is buried there. And then the last one, this is my favorite one, is Vic Rashi. Any of you old-time baseball fans know who Vic Rashi was? Pete, I'm sure you do. Well, Vic Rashi was one of the all-time great Yankee pitchers. When I got my first set of Topps baseball cards, which came in those bubblegum wrappers for a nickel way back when, Vic Rashi was one of the people that I got in a card. I also, later on, because my cousin hated the Yankees and traded me a Junior Gilliam for 3 1951 Mickey Mantles. And if any of you know what happened to those, you will understand why I'm up here slogging through writing books rather than sitting in my mansion in Palm Beach. I looked this up the other day, and the last auction sale of a 51 Mickey Mantle went for $2.8 million. So, who can guess what happened to my 3 cards? My mother happened to my 3 cards, just like she probably happened to many of your baseball cards. I used to show my card collection at the Sonnenberg Hobby Show every year, and actually won once or twice. But when I went off to college and I came back for Thanksgiving, my baseball cards were gone. And I said, "What'd you do with them?" She said, "I knew you wouldn't be interested in these anymore now that you're almost an adult." And I couldn't believe it. And then I said later on, when my mother moved in with us when she was in her high 80s, and she lived with us for a good number of years after that, I kept telling her, I said, you know what you've done to me by this? These cards are worth a fortune. And she said, if it hadn't been for mothers like me, these cards wouldn't be worth anything. Well, anyway, Vic Rashi is another one who was born in Massachusetts. He was a star athlete in high school, a 3-sport superstar, really, and a Yankee scout signed him to a contract when he was 16 years old. The quid pro quo is the Rashi family said, you have to pay for his college and then he can play baseball. So they paid for 4 years at William and Mary, where he met his wife, who was from Livingston County. Well, he went on to the minor leagues with something called the Amsterdam Rug Makers. All these minor league great names are now gone because the majors have decided they don't need all these minor league teams anymore. The best one to me was the Macon Whoopies. who have now become, and they're now an independent because no major league team wants them, and they're now called the Macon Bacon. But you don't get good names like that anymore. That kind of creativity has gone down the tubes. So anyway, Vic starts out in the minors and then immediately gets drafted into World War II. And he spends 5 years with the Army Air Force as a physical education instructor. He never saw combat. But after the war, he came back, and in 1946, he went to the Binghamton Triplets, which are a Yankee farm team. And they called him up toward the end of the year in September. And in his first game, he pitched a complete game victory against the Philadelphia, now the Kansas City Athletics. He then pitched the last game of the year and beat the Athletics again. So in 1947, what did they do after this impressive start? They send him back down to the minor leagues. But this time they called him up mid-season. He went 8-2. He had a very low earned run average, and he clinched the pennant on the last day of the year for the Yankees in 1948. After that, the Yankees went on a 5-year World Series victory run from 1949 to 53, during which Rashi won 92 games and lost 40, and had 3 seasons in a row where he was a 20-game winner, which is very, very impressive. He went into George Weiss, the notorious general manager of the Yankees, and asked for a raise. And Weiss said, "Okay, I'm going to give you a raise, and you make $40,000, which is more than any Yankee pitcher in history has ever made, inflation included. But if you ever have a bad year, you're taking a pay cut." Well, it turned out that in 1954, he went 13-6, and Weiss considered that a bad year. So Rashi decided he's going to hold out, and he didn't go to spring training. Whereupon the Yankees traded him to the St. Louis Cardinals, and he spent his last 2 years with St. Louis and then with the Kansas City Athletics. When he retired, he went to Livingston County, where his wife was from, to Groveland, and he bought a liquor store in Canisius, and he ran that liquor store for a good long time, while he also coached baseball and basketball at what is now SUNY Geneseo. And in addition to that, he taught elementary school all the way until he passed away in 1989. And I should say one thing, just as an aside. When Mickey Mantle, who was my boyhood hero, won the Triple Crown, leading the league in home runs and runs batted in and in batting in 1956, he went in to see George Weiss, and George Weiss tried to get him to take a pay cut. So, and as Weiss's wife said when he retired, she said, "I married him for better or worse, but not for lunch." And that brings us to the actual book. The book is divided into 7 parts. The first one being the Iroquois, and I picked out 6 Native Americans that I wanted to write about, followed by a part on the land barons. These are all the people that then screwed the Indians out of all their land. And then the longest section is called 19th Century VIPs, followed by the Burned Over District. You know, this was a place where religious fervor was so intense at one time that it got that appellation, Burned Over District. Then the Rights Revolution, which really is about, largely about the women who fought for women's rights in the 19th and early 20th century. And then 20th century riparians, and that's followed by the last section, which is moguls. These were all the business tycoons like John D. Rockefeller and like my omitted Henry Flagler, who came from this region. It was kind of tough coming up with some kind of rational organizational scheme for this. And it took me a long while to try to figure it out. I probably didn't do a very good job because that 19th century VIP section has about 19 or 20 people in it because I couldn't think of any other way to differentiate them into more than one big group. The Native Americans, this was interesting to me because I had known, of course, about how bad the situation was when the Europeans came over and snookered the Native Americans out of their lands, but I didn't know how bad it was. And this was a real eye-opener to me. We always say that slavery is America's original sin. And while it's certainly a sin, I disagree that it's the original one. I think the way we treated Native Americans is more appropriate to that label. The Iroquois got here sometime probably around the 9th or 10th century. Nobody really knows for sure because, of course, there aren't any written records. You've heard of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Song of Hiawatha. Well, that Hiawatha is not the Hiawatha that is really the father of the Iroquois and the individual who cobbled together the Iroquois Confederacy. It's a totally different Hiawatha. Longfellow kind of took one from column A and one from column B and said, now I've got Hiawatha. But his Hiawatha is from the upper Midwest. Our Hiawatha is from the Finger Lakes. And our Hiawatha was a political genius. And sometime in the 12th century, as best scholars can determine, Hiawatha crafted the Iroquois Confederacy. And he put that together by taking the 5 tribes, the Senecas, the Cayugas, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, and the Mohawks, and all of whom were somewhat related and had migrated from west of the Mississippi down around, at that point, the Arkansas area, although there's some evidence that they originated in the Valley of Mexico, near Mexico City at one point. They came east because they were running away from a lot of violence that they had been subjected to by the tribes that were out in the Mississippi Valley. Well, Hiawatha, in around 1150, as best we can determine, and some scholars actually have put a precise date on the origins of the Iroquois Confederacy because they said it surely had to coincide with an eclipse that they discovered and with the beginning of the harvest season. And so they say that it was formed on August 31st, 1142. You know, I wouldn't take that to the bank, however. The Iroquois Confederacy was a remarkable political construct. It had a legislature. It had an advisory council that acted as something of a court, and it had a third branch, an executive branch, that was really the Onondaga sachems. And so you can see where I'm going with this. This has a lot of resonance and a lot of relevance for the formation of the United States. It also was a matriarchate. The women in the Iroquois Confederacy really controlled most of the political power, which is, when you think about all of this in context, this is really amazing. Well, what happened was that as the United States was starting to germinate in the middle of the 18th century, people like Benjamin Franklin were taking a long, hard look at the Iroquois Confederacy. And he learned a lot about it from another guy has a chapter in the book named Canandaigua, who was a Native American whom Franklin met at a negotiation between the state of Pennsylvania and the Iroquois in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1744. And Canandaigua educated Franklin about all of this. Now, if you then move up a few years to the Constitutional Convention, you will hear from Jefferson and Madison that we are basing the United States and the framing of the Constitution on the philosophes of the Enlightenment, people like David Hume, people like John Locke, people like Montesquieu. If you look at Franklin, though, he will say, no, we're basing this on the Iroquois Confederacy and what they put together. It's pretty impressive. It was something of a democracy that the Iroquois had. Hopefully, we'll still have a democracy in a few years. One little aside, Red Jacket, of course, who was probably the first Iroquois that any of us ever heard of if we were growing up in this area. I'm not going to say a whole lot about him because you probably know quite a bit about him already. The one thing I will say is that his Seneca name, Sagoya-Witha, is translated as he who cannot shut up. And he did talk a lot. He was a good talker. But the one Native American that I researched and wrote about that impressed me the most was a man named Ely Parker. Ely Parker what came from Seneca royalty. His father fought in the War of 1812 for the United States, and his mother was the great niece of Red Jacket and the great granddaughter of Handsome Lake, who also has a chapter in the book. He was educated in white schools, and where he was a fantastic student and a voracious reader. And at the age of 14, the Seneca Nation made him their interpreter and their author of their official tribal documents. In the 1840s, they sent him to Albany and then to Washington to protest the taking of Seneca lands. He was unsuccessful in both of those, but when he came back to this area, he said, I'm going to go to law school because that's going to help my nation, see what we can do. Well, he studied, nobody went to law school per se in those days. They read the law under an attorney, a licensed attorney. And he did that in Ellicottville, New York. And after 3 years, he then discovered when he applied for admission to the bar that New York State had a law that no Native Americans could be admitted to the bar. But undeterred, he didn't collapse and say, oh my God, I've ruined my life. He said, okay, I'll become an engineer. So he enrolled in Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, RPI, in Troy, and got his degree and was immediately hired by a firm that was managing the Erie Canal. And he rose in the ranks so rapidly that within a few months, he was the superintendent of the western terminus of the canal in Buffalo. He then was a little bit of a digression into his Seneca side. The Wolf Clan mothers made him the leading sachem of the Seneca Nation. And he really had the highest honor and the highest position in the Seneca tribe at that point. But he continued his engineering career, and he became the chief engineer for the Chesapeake and Albemarle Canal in Virginia. And he so impressed the Secretary of the Treasury that he put him in charge of the Lake District engineering function, which included Lake Superior, Huron, and Michigan. In 1857, they sent him to Galena, Illinois, and this is where the story gets really interesting. He was sent there to build a hospital and to build a customs house. And while he was there, he became very close friends with a clerk in a general store. He first met him when he was walking by and the clerk was sweeping out the store. And later, that clerk had one of his drunken binges and Ely Parker saved his life. He was about to injure himself rather severely. Anybody know who that clerk was? Ulysses S. Grant. Grant had been drummed out of the Army after the Mexican War because of they had, every once in a while after a war, typically, the Army gets rid of its mid-rank officers because there's too many of them. And Grant was one of those, lost his career in the Army, went to work for his brother-in-law in the store in Galena, Illinois. Now we come to the Civil War. Well, Ely Parker decides, I want to fight. So he goes to Washington and he meets with another eminent riparian, William Seward of Auburn, New York, who happens to be the Secretary of State for Abraham Lincoln. And he says, I want to enlist or I want a commission. And Seward says, no, you can't have that. This is a white man's war. We don't want any Native Americans fighting for us. So Parker went home to his farm in western New York, and he's there farming away. And 2 years later, in the spring of 1863, a Union Army officer rides up to him and hands him a commission as a captain in the Engineers, signed by Abraham Lincoln. He goes into the Union Army, and after a few months, Ulysses Grant learns that Ely Parker is in the Union Army. And so he cuts a set of orders to bring him to Vicksburg, where there's about to be a great battle. And he is now on Grant's staff, much to the annoyance and chagrin of many of Grant's staff officers who were horrified at the thought that Grant was now having a Native American with him. Well, he stayed with Grant all the way through Lookout Mountain and Chattanooga and the Wilderness, all the way to Richmond. And in the winter of 1864, as the war is winding down, Abraham Lincoln makes several trips down to Richmond where he has dinner with Grant and Ely Parker. And Ely Parker gets the opportunity to inform Lincoln about all of the injustices that the Native Americans have suffered. Now we come to Appomattox. And Appomattox, Parker is now a colonel. Appomattox, he prepares the surrender documents for Robert E. Lee to sign. And when Lee shakes hands with Parker, he says to him, well, I'm glad there's at least one American here. And Parker says, sir, we are all Americans. There's a wonderful photograph that I think is in the book where Ely Parker and Grant and Lee are together at Appomattox. Well, after the war was over, he had now been promoted to brigadier general, and he went to work in Washington for the War Department, stayed there for 4 years, and when Grant was elected president and took office in 1869, he appointed Parker to be the head of Indian Affairs, the commissioner, and it was the first Native American that ever held that position. The next year, he was about to get married, And this was going to be one of the marriages of the season in Washington. A very, very big deal. Julia Grant was helping to organize it. And Ely Parker got cold feet on the day of the wedding and didn't show up. He'd gone off and gotten dead drunk somewhere. Grant sent out his boys to look for him. They found him, and a week later, Grant gave the bride away in a smaller, more modest ceremony. It was a white woman, and Parker was getting cold feet because he thought, oh my God, what are they going to say when I marry a white woman? In 1872, Parker was accused of embezzlement, and articles of impeachment were drawn up in Congress, but it turned out that these charges were all bogus and they were somewhat racially motivated, and as a consequence of that, Parker was so angry that he resigned his position and he went back to Western New York and was going to resume farming, hoping that he could find some work as an engineer, but there really wasn't any. So this remarkable man turned his talents to Wall Street, and he made an absolute fortune. He built himself a mansion in Connecticut and lived out his days there. Well, you can see why I thought this guy is really unbelievable, and why he's the one that I selected from that part to really talk about tonight. The land barons is the next section, and I can see that in my usual way I've totally overdone this, and I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to whip through this pretty quickly. Oliver Phelps and Nathanael Gorham, those of us who come from this area know all about them. They basically laid out the streets of Canandaigua and Geneva. Couple of interesting factoids. First, when they hired a surveyor to survey the Phelps and Gorham purchase, the guy made a mistake. These Phelps and Gorham had set up their land office in Geneva, and what happened was the surveyor blew it and left Geneva out of the purchase. So they said, okay, we'll have to move the office to Canandaigua. And I think Genevans have been annoyed by that ever since. The other interesting fact is that they bought the purchased lands from Massachusetts, which had a claim on this region. Gets very, very complicated. Connecticut also had a claim. New York State, obviously. And of course, we cannot forget that the Indians had a claim too, a pretty valid one. The problem here was that they agreed that they were going to pay Massachusetts in installments using these deep discounted Massachusetts bonds. Well, what happened in between the purchase and the first installment that was due was that Alexander Hamilton, the new Secretary of the Treasury, assumed all of the state's debts. And that caused these bond values to skyrocket. Well, that meant that Phelps and Gorham couldn't buy these cheap bonds to pay Massachusetts. So they basically went belly up. And they sold the land, most of it, to Robert Morris, whom you may remember from your history books, was the financier of the American Revolution, and a gentleman who saved George Washington's financial bacon many times over. Well, Morris never came to this area, but he sent his son Thomas up here to run the land office and to see if they could sell their plots and if they could settle title to the lands vis-a-vis the Native Americans. They settled title with the help of a lot of bribes and with alcohol. And ultimately, of course, snookered the Senecas anyway out of much of their lands. Which brings us to Gideon Granger, whom we all know about and who I discovered some interesting facts about. Gideon Granger was the longest serving Postmaster General in United States history. He was appointed by Thomas Jefferson in 1801. He was fired by James Madison in 1814. The reason being that a Supreme Court vacancy had come up and Granger wanted it. The problem being that Madison didn't want Granger. So Granger brought in all of the heavy artillery. He wrote to Thomas Jefferson and asked if he would put in a good word for him, and so on. The urban legend has it that when the sitting members of the Supreme Court found out that Granger might be nominated to the court, they got in their wagons. They went down Pennsylvania Avenue. At that time, the court met in the Senate, in a very small kind of enclosed space that actually my wife and I have visited at one time. And they went to Madison en masse and said, if you appoint Granger, we're all quitting. Now, why did that happen? It was because Granger was allegedly notorious for having the worst flatulence problem in Washington. And I, of course, thought all the time, this is surely an urban legend. And I was combing through some letters in the Historical Society a few years ago between Granger and his wife, who very wisely and for reasons that will become obvious, did not accompany him to Washington as Postmaster General. She stayed in Connecticut. And in those letters, he goes into painful, excruciating detail about his gastrointestinal problems. Which brings me to William Morgan. William Morgan was a gentleman in Batavia who threatened to reveal the secrets of the Masons. And he wrote a book, and he was going to get that book published. The Masons were not very happy about this, so they drummed up a bogus charge against him of being a debtor, and he got thrown into the Ontario County Jail. A couple nights later, a group of vigilantes came by, dragged him out of jail, and we think hied him off to Fort Niagara. And he was never seen or heard from again. Well, this outrage prompted a political movement called the Anti-Masonic Party. The Anti-Masonic Party actually captured the imagination of a good number of people in this area and then around the country. And in 1831, they held the first political convention in the United States in Baltimore. And then in 1832, they ran candidates for president and vice president. And they kind of flamed out pretty quickly after that and morphed into, they didn't really morph into the Whigs, but they became part of the larger Whig Party universe. And in 1836, the Whigs ran William Henry Harrison for president and Gideon's son Francis Granger of Canandaigua for vice president. And this became the only time in the history of the United States that the constitutional provision that said if a vice presidential candidate doesn't get a sufficient number of electoral votes, the Senate has to decide who will be vice president. Well, it turns out that the Senate decided, but they did not decide that it would be Francis Granger. In 1840, a few feelers were put out by Harrison when he was nominated again for president as to whether Granger would be interested. And after his bitter experience 4 years earlier, he basically said not only no, but hell no. So a guy named John Tyler became the vice presidential candidate. And as you all know, Harrison decided to deliver an inaugural address lasting 2.5 hours in a snowstorm, went back to the White House, contracted pneumonia, went to bed, and died 30 days later, and John Tyler became President of the United States. So there, but for the grace of God, goes Canandaigua. William Morgan also became a very useful character when it came to the career of William Seward, who was being promoted by a newspaper publisher named Thurlow Weed. And when a body washed up in the Niagara River and couldn't be identified, Thurlow Weed said, well, it's a good enough William Morgan for me. And so he used that to kind of exploit this anti-Masonic sentiment and advance the career of William Seward. One interesting fact before I leave William Morgan is that Morgan's widow, who is described in the literature as a comely lass, was courted by Francis Granger, and she rejected him and instead married Joseph Smith of Palmyra, who is, of course, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. She became one of his multiple wives. And we don't know how many. It's somewhere between 11 and 48. Nobody really knows for sure. I want to finish with talking about some relatives, some collateral relatives of my wife's cousins, John Canfield Spencer and Philip Spencer. John Canfield Spencer was a lawyer in Canandaigua. His biggest claim to fame is probably that he hosted Alexis de Tocqueville when he came through town on his mission from the French government to study the U.S. prison system. De Tocqueville and his colleague stayed with the Spencers for 3 days and then left. And he wrote a letter to his sister-in-law in Paris and said, we've got to get out of here because these daughters of John Spencer are just drop dead gorgeous and I can't take it anymore. And the true story. And he left. Now, Philip Spencer, his son, was a graduate of Canandaigua Academy and then joined the Navy as an ensign. And he was on a ship to Africa, and on the way back, he was accused of mutiny. This is the only time in U.S. naval history that anybody was executed for mutiny. He was hung by the yardarm, and at the time, his father, John Spencer, was the Secretary of War of the United States under John Tyler. The Navy, as a consequence of this, well, two things happened. First of all, Herman Melville, who was a cousin of one of the officers on the ship, decided this is worthy of a novel, and he wrote Billy Budd, based on Philip Spencer's demise. The Navy was appalled by what happened and decided that they needed a better training system for their young midshipmen. And as a result, they launched the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. I could go on for hours, but I'd like to leave a little time for questions, and we're limited to a total of an hour. So thanks for your attention. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Okay, then. We're done. Yeah.
I could have one question.
Oh, okay, Jack, go ahead.
What would you tell just a little bit? I was fascinated by the relationship between the abolitionists and the suffragettes. Particularly their debate about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, about whether women should be included in the provisions.
This was something that was pushed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and it caused a rift in their longtime close and cordial relationship with Frederick Douglass, because he looked upon what they were doing as being racially motivated. But you're absolutely right. They saw the Civil War amendments as an opportunity to argue that women had the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony in 1872 actually voted in Rochester in the presidential election. She voted for Grant, who was running for re-election. Then she was put on trial, and there was a change of venue because there was so much publicity in Rochester, and the new venue was the Canandaigua courthouse. And that at those days, Supreme Court justices rode a circuit when the court was not in session in Washington. And Justice Hunt came to Canandaigua and presided over the trial of Susan B. Anthony. She was convicted. She was fined $100. He asked her if she had anything to say, and she said, "I'm never going to pay your damn fine." And she never did time for it. Brian, you had a question.
I just wanted to comment on Philip Spencer. His portrait hangs in the courthouse, along with many other luminaries of local lore. And Judge Henry used to tell the story of Herman Melville and Billy Budd and what happened with respect to that walking the plank. And I must have heard that story from Judge Henry a dozen times, if not more. But to hear you tell it again, and just to let some of the folks know that there's a lot of history up there in the portrait gallery.
I'll have to go look. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, then. Thank you all for coming.